Welcome back at WNST, Towson, Baltimore, and Baltimore Positive. We are merging the brands here this week, and while the Orioles are continuing their pennant race run, one thing for sure with the Ravens, other than the boogeyman getting them in the virus and, shutting down the operation, which is still out there, they can't lose for another month, right? So these preseason games that always sort of spawned injuries and starters never played anyway. We've sort of foregone all of that. I know you're going to be trying to spend some time out there at some point, and there's a line to get in and whatnot. Give me a little primer on what you're expecting for Luke Jones, what the Ravens are expecting to do, and boy, Matt Skura is back, right? So there's some news to start the week that's good news, right?
Yeah, definitely great news. I mean, not completely unexpected based on the way that it's been trending, but when you go back to late November at the Coliseum last season, and Matt Skura tears his ACL, his MCL, his PCL, and a dislocated kneecap for his left knee. That's a really tough injury. Marshall Yanda, if you remember, his second year tore up his knee against Indianapolis. That I think it was week 5, maybe somewhere around there. And I know he was back for the following training camp in 2009. That was the first training camp I ever covered on the beat, but it was a struggle for him to the point that, remember, he didn't regain his starting job until probably midway through the season in 2009. So for Matt Skura to be back for the first full padded practice, and they're going to bring him along, I'm sure he's not going to be taking 100% of the reps, but you have to like it, because if there's one area of this team right now that you point to on either side of the ball where you really don't have a great idea how it's going to go, it's the interior offensive line, and more specifically right guard. But what's the trickle-down effect there? Is it just a one-for-one, someone replacing Marshall Yanda, or do they move Matt Skura around? Do they move Bradley Bozeman to another spot off of left guard? So that interior offensive line picture, I think, is really the most interesting, uncertain position group that the Ravens have on either side of the ball. Not that they won't necessarily find a solution, but I think it's very much up in the air what that's going to look like. So I'm going to be looking at that first and foremost, and then we can talk about some other groups, and certainly talking about the third safety that this team ran so much dime last year, or what the running back carry distribution is going to look like, and kick returner, which we've talked about every year since Jacoby Jones left. There's certainly some other spots, but it begins with that interior offensive line and just really what that's going to ultimately look like, not just for the first day of training camp or the first week or even week 1. What does it look like over the bulk of the season? Because I can tell you at this time last year, everyone thought Jermaine Illuminor was probably the favorite to be the left guard. And it was right around this point in August when the Ravens clearly weren't confident enough in him. They pivoted to Bradley Bozeman, and he ended up doing a nice job. So as much as you might look at it now and say, okay, DJ Fluker's the veteran newcomer, probably the early favorite at right guard by default, just because of how crazy this offseason or lack thereof has been, but we don't know that. It could be Patrick McCarry. It could be Ben Powers in year 2 taking a big leap. It could be a rookie like Ben Bredesen. So there's lots of possibilities, but the problem is you can't identify any of those guys as a sure thing. Even DJ Fluker, yeah, he started a lot of games in the league, but hasn't really played at a high level the last couple of years, even starting at some other stops. So that's the big position I'm looking at. Not that it's going to torpedo the offense, because still has a heck of a lot going for it, starting with the league MVP coming back. But I think there are questions on the inside of that offensive line that I'm really going to be looking, not just to see who's lining up there for the first day, but how do each of these guys look? How are they shuffling guys around? Because I think there are a lot of possibilities to see how this thing's going to play out in that regard.
Luke Jones joining us here. He will be monitoring all things at training camp with the Ravens. You can find him, Luke, at WNST.net, as well as Baltimore Luke out on social media. I guess I haven't thought much about football, like really football. And you know that because we haven't talked much about football. We've talked about all the other things in regard to, a pandemic going on and a plague. Now that we're talking about football, and I think about what I've read other people saying about the Ravens and what the concerns are around the league about, the 14-2 team that couldn't get out of its own way for a week in January. The story is, they had all these running backs and they drafted another one. How's that going to work? Well, there's still only one football, right? And the one thing I'm interested in seeing is how much they want to pass the football if there's a normal season. I have to couch everything. Like, I feel like we should speak in the cones of silence or in some sort of state of, there is no plague. There's always going to be a plague here. So there's that behind it. But if they're going to play 6 weeks, 8 weeks, 10 weeks into the season, I would be interested to see how much they profile to pass the football in ways they didn't last year.
Yeah, I think that's going to be a really interesting dynamic as far as how that plays out because, one, I think it was evident in what happened in that Tennessee game. Not that I'm putting it all on Lamar Jackson by any stretch of the imagination, but just that scenario playing out. You fall behind a couple touchdowns, and suddenly you're not dictating the offensive game plan. You're not dictating the flow of the game. You're having to respond, and you're in a position where this team threw the ball incredibly well from an efficiency standpoint last year. But what was the big reason why? The run set that up. Game situation set that up. They could throw it when they wanted to. The question is, and this was exposed a little bit in the Titans game, is what happens when they must throw the football. And we saw the answer to that. It wasn't great. Now, again, not all Lamar Jackson by any means. Keep in mind, there were probably 5 legitimate drops in that game, and there were 2 or 3 others that were certainly plays that could have been made. So you're looking at Marquise Brown. You're looking at what Miles Boykin does year 1 to year 2 because he's the one young wide receiver they have that profiles as being a guy that can make plays on the outside, which is something they're going to need. As much as they just thrive throwing the ball over the middle, at some point you got to be able to make those plays outside the numbers. And Lamar Jackson's talked about that in some of his spring and summer Zoom conference calls with the media, how much he's worked on outbreaking routes, which he did a lot better with last year than he did as a rookie. But if you're looking for, I don't even want to call it a weakness, but let's say a relative weakness, an area he's not as proficient with as all the other areas, it is throwing outside the numbers. So how do some of those young wide receivers look? Certainly you throw Devin Duvernay and James Prochet into that mix potentially. You still have Willie Snead, but again, most of those guys other than Boykin are more slot types. Even Marquise Brown did his best work running out of the slot and over the middle of the field. So there's that. And I also think you look at what happened with the Hayden Hurst trade, and to this point, we still don't know who the number 3 tight end's going to be. And yeah, they brought in, Jarrell Adams, who's been around in the league, but hasn't done much. Jacob Breeland, who the Oregon rookie free agent, who a lot of people were really high on, he's already on reserve non-football injury, recovering from the ACL he had at Oregon last year. So you're looking at Jarrell Adams, who is a veteran, but not overly established in this league. Charles Scarf, who was on the practice squad last year, and Eli Wolf, another rookie free agent. So what our Mark Andrews is going to do, and I think you'll see him, assuming he's healthy, take on a little more of a workload because people kind of forget Mark Andrews and Hayden Hurst played the same number of offensive snaps last year. It's just that Andrews got more targets, was more productive, and quickly became Lamar Jackson's favorite target. Nick Boyle's going to contribute to some degree as a receiver, but he's much more of the blocking tight end. So they're going to have a third tight end, whether they bring someone in or it's one of the guys I just mentioned. However, do we see this offense evolve a little bit where maybe not quite as 2 tight end heavy, and maybe there's a little more of a shift towards a few more 3 wide receiver sets, a little more involvement in terms of volume for your wide receivers? So I think it's reasonable to expect some evolution there in that regard. But I'll continue to come back to, this was a record-setting rushing attack last year, from Lamar Jackson to Mark Ingram and certainly Gus Edwards. Now you throw J.K. Dobbins in the mix, and to your point, there's one football. So I'm I'm not
Where's
here.
the controversy not here, right? Like here, we're like they'll figure it out. They know what they're doing. But
Yeah,
if you need to talk about the Ravens on the radio in Denver this week or Dallas this week, this is the thing you say about the Ravens, right? Like Lamar choked and they have too many running backs and they're not going to do what they did last year again, and the Titans figured them out. That's going to be the narrative, right? That's going to be what we're going to hear the talking heads talk about until such point they take the field, beat the Browns, go down to Houston and take care of business, and then have this, mega thing against Kansas City in front of no one but for everyone.
sure, but yeah, to
Because
some of the
the bullets start going quick at the beginning of the season, right? Like,
yeah, I
come
mean,
out of it, go down to Houston and lose, come back here and lose to Kansas City by a field goal, you're 1-2. All of a sudden, you've got the plague, even though you don't have the plague.
but at the same time, I think it's going to be interesting because all these teams are in the same boat here. I mean, we talked about this some with the lockout in 2011, where there was nothing all spring and the start of summer, and then suddenly they come up with a new CBA on July 20th, whatever it was. 5 days later, free agency starts, and then they're in camp. So that's where teams like the Ravens, Pittsburgh, go down the list. All the teams that have well-established coaches, well-established quarterbacks, have some continuity with their coordinators. They're going to be better equipped for this. But Lamar Jackson talked about this. John Harbaugh has talked about it. It's going to have a little more of a college football feel in the sense of there's going to be so much unknown. I mean, how are the Ravens going to truly scout what to expect from the Cleveland Browns? Okay, you can watch last year's tape, but it's a new coaching staff. Okay, you can look at Kevin Stefanski and Minnesota and try to get some
tricky
ideas there.
Baker Mayfield.
Sure, but and you're not even, as much as we talk about the vanilla nature of the preseason, you're not even going to have that. So there's going to be a lot of unknown, but at the same time, the Ravens, yeah, they have to prepare for that, but Greg Roman's going to have some new wrinkles as well. So I don't expect this team to break another NFL single season rushing record. I think history would suggest there's going to be a little bit of statistical regression. However, that's not to say that this isn't going to remain the best running game in the NFL by a pretty wide margin. I just think it might be a little more reimagined. Mark Ingram may not have as many carries. Gus Edwards may have fewer carries. J.K. Dobbins, I'm not saying he's going to be the guy from week one, but go look at what that kid did at Ohio State and tell me you'd be shocked if he's not their starter by week 12. I'm not saying that as a diss on Mark Ingram. It's just I think Dobbins is that talented. It's why the Ravens took him at the end of the second round. So, and we're still talking about a quarterback, 1,200 yards rushing, 6.9 yards per carry. Yes, I know you want to do things to protect Lamar Jackson, but what makes this offense special, what makes this running game special is the ball in his hands, and you don't want to deviate too much from that. So is he going to carry it as much as he did last year? Maybe not, but I also don't see that those carries being cut in half or anything like that. He's still going to run plenty, so it's just going to – I think it's more tweaks. This team did go 14-2. I don't think the Titans – quote, figured them out. The Ravens moved the ball pretty well over the course of the game. They turned it over. And those fourth downs that they were so proficient with last year, they picked the absolute worst time to not be proficient with it. So you don't want to change too much from what worked going 14-2 and having a historic offense that the Ravens have never had in their 25 years here in Baltimore. But yeah, you're going to tweak and you're going to evolve. And like I said, maybe you see the passing game trend a little more toward wide receiver, a little tiny bit less towards the tight ends, but you don't want to fix something that isn't broken. So this offense was incredible last year. So I think it's much more a case of evolving and tweaking rather than, got to throw to the wide receivers way more than we did, or we need to throw the ball less or throw the ball more and not run it quite as much. It worked pretty damn good last year. It was just a matter of they had their worst game at the worst absolute time. So I think you have to have some acknowledgement of that. You do learn from that, you hope, and that's going to be something we're not going to learn until January, right? I mean, they can't be, as Calais Campbell said the other week, we can't win the Super Bowl right now. We can't even win the season opener yet. We've got to focus on each day of practice and getting that much better in whatever we're focusing on, whether it's red zone or third down situations or sudden change defense, whatever it is on either side of the ball. So I think, if you're this team, there's some questions, but I would surely take the Ravens question marks over virtually any other team's questions right now in the NFL, because that's how talented and young this roster is going into 2020.
You did your series. I'm just going through back in June. You had your top regular season games. You did a whole month of it back when I was doing rock and roll. And man, of all the surreal things during a regular season, sitting in the roof of the LA Memorial Coliseum and looking off at the Hollywood sign and looking up at the scoreboard, it's 45-6 or whatever it was pretty surreal. And to think that that's going to happen again or happen as frequently as it happened last year, these seasons are all different. I mean, this one's already different because of this pandemic and how weird all of this is and whether they'll finish this or not. And I'm still skeptical about all of that. But there is a point where if you start to get revved up and start talking football, which we haven't done a whole lot of, because as Calais Campbell said, not only can you not win the Super Bowl, they still can't win a game for a month. I'm starting to get the taste of it again and get the feel of it again. And really the feel of how good this team is and what the potential is for the team. It is very, very unfortunate in lots of ways the plague is here. But for the football team and for the franchise, they were poised to really put the foot down. And much as though the Orioles are interesting in this little mini season, this drama of 32 teams and 20 weeks of football and a plague going on in our country and the politics that's going to happen here in regard to this and the knee and whether people are going to go to the games or the Ravens are going to let anybody go to their games or not. There's definitely a lot of meat on the bone here just from a drama sports football standpoint as to whether they're going to get to the field. And when they do, they're interesting just because they are, right? They're among the more interesting teams in the NFL as well.
Yeah, I mean, and they're one of the best, if not the best. I mean, let's not forget, this was pretty clearly, as much as I give Kansas City full credit, they played their absolute best football and they erased deficits and all of their each step to a Super Bowl championship. The Ravens were easily the best team in the NFL in the regular season last year. Are they going to go 14-2 again? I'm going to say not, just because going 14-2 again is incredibly difficult. I already mentioned I'm not expecting them to eclipse their rushing record from last year. But guess what? We've kind of talked about the Ravens being a year behind the Kansas City Chiefs. And you kind of think about what happened with Patrick Mahomes and his second season and what happened to them. They lost in the playoffs to New England. And what happened last year? They weren't as productive statistically from an offensive standpoint. Patrick Mahomes didn't win league MVP again, but they were still great. They still were right there. They were the number 2 seed, and they won a Super Bowl. So if you're the Ravens, as much as – and they're not going to talk this way because you just don't hear them verbalize this, certainly to the media or to fans. But, right now they thought about this a lot in the offseason of, my goodness, we were 14-2. It was sitting right there. We had home field advantage. And
we didn't even get to play the Chiefs.
We choked. So you're fighting that, and you're kind of looking at the schedule, and and look, you look at the schedule. I don't think it's a particularly ominous schedule in terms of how it sets up. I think it's pretty favorable. I am certainly looking at, I think the Vegas has the Ravens over under for wins. I've seen 11.5 typically. I would absolutely take the over.
How does Vegas pay these bets if the season doesn't finish? What happens then?
I'm guessing it would just be canceled. I think.
No
but the point I was going to make is, guess what? Lamar Jackson doesn't have to win the MVP again for the Ravens to win the Super Bowl. The Ravens don't have to go 14-2 again to win the Super Bowl. Now, that doesn't mean Lamar can have a bad season or have a high ankle sprain that costs him 5 weeks and isn't right. Or the Ravens
go 10-6 and look good in January.
or you go 12-4 and maybe Kansas City ends up being the number 1 seed and you're number 2, which this year means no bye. But hey, they had the bye last year and it didn't turn out so great. And the Ravens have won 2 Super Bowls not having a bye before. So As much as, yes, last year was such a missed opportunity, and now because of the pandemic and the uncertainty there and just not knowing what's going to happen from an injury standpoint, and knowing that they're now a year closer to some really rich contracts they're going to have to hand out to, whether it's a Matt Judon, whether, Ronnie Stanley, Marlon Humphrey, Mark Andrews, and, the quarterback who's pretty good and is probably going to be asking for, money in the neighborhood of Patrick Mahomes at the very least, if not more. But you don't need to replicate every statistical accomplishment. You don't even have to go 14-2. Just go out and compartmentalize and put last year behind you and go out and play great football. And that's what Kansas City was still able to do, even if they didn't score quite as many touchdowns. And Pat Mahomes dealt with the knee for a few weeks, and he wasn't as statistically insane as he was in 2018, but they got to January and then they did their thing. So, if you're the Ravens, it's just, not trying to match everything you did last year or say that you need to be better. It's just a matter of going out and playing good football consistently and doing what you need to do and hoping that you have good fortune in terms of health. And, now that health aspect takes on a totally different meaning in the midst of the pandemic and testing and all that. But this team could go 12-4 and, maybe rush for 500 fewer yards than they did last year. And Lamar Jackson's not throwing 36 touchdowns and 6 interceptions, and being, this historically efficient passer and quite as explosive of a rusher. And they could still be holding the Lombardi Trophy at the end of the season without any questions asked, because that's how talented, how good, how well coached this football team is. And that's where, to your point, the Orioles are a really nice story right now, and it's fun, but the expectations for the Ravens, let's call a spade a spade. Anything less than winning the Super Bowl, assuming not a slew of catastrophic injuries, like 2015 comes to mind, assuming you don't have that scenario play out, this team doesn't at least get to the Super Bowl and I think win the Super Bowl, then it's going to kind of feel like a disappointment, right? I mean, if you're going to have the redemption from last season, well, you have to win the Super Bowl to do that, right? So there are incredibly high expectations, but guess what? I think this team is completely okay with that. And I think you have a coaching staff led by John Harbaugh, who this isn't his first rodeo, that I think they're okay with the idea of, them being positioned right next to Kansas City and saying, hey, it's Super Bowl or bust. If you don't make it, then this year is going to be a disappointment. And not to say anyone loses their job over it, but you're going to be looking at it and saying, well, this team is poised to be that kind of championship caliber team again. If they don't at least get there, let alone try to win it, or to win it, then yeah, I think people are going to be disappointed. But when you go 14-2, you put that target on your back. I mean, that's just where they are right now, and they're okay with that because they know they have every, they don't have an excuse to be anything less than, maybe not 14-2, but certainly in that 12-4, 13-3 kind of range, because the talent suggests that's exactly where they should be.
He is Luke Jones. He is Baltimore Luke, and Luke at WNST.net. He'll be virtually in Owings Mills in there whenever.
We'll be there. We'll be there starting Monday morning. I think it's up to 30 reporters they can accommodate outside. Nestor, I did the math. This will be the first time in over 5 months I've stepped foot on the Owings Mills grounds there at one winning drive. That is the longest I've gone between trips to Owings Mills since 2011. So you're talking almost a decade since I've had this long of a stretch. The last time I was at the facility was Marshall Yanda's retirement press conference back in mid-March, approaching mid-March. So we'll be out there. The Zooms and the conference calls, that's all virtual, but we will have the opportunity to watch practice. So definitely be checking out WNST.net, my blog sponsored by Coons Baltimore Forward, as far as the latest, who's practicing, who's not, injuries, as much as I can within the media reporting rules as far as who's lining up where, but certainly we'll have impressions, and it'll be nice to actually have some fresh on-field football to talk about for the first time since, that disappointing January night against the Tennessee Titans, at least as it relates to the Ravens anyway.
Well, time will tell. The Orioles are keeping it interesting. The Caps maybe not so much, and certainly the NBA hockey. There's plenty of things
No
if you're
doubt.
digging sports on hot summer nights to keep us occupied. Ravens during the day, Orioles at night. Luke is doing a double duty here in August. We gave you a couple months off. Go work. Go have some fun.
There we go. It'll be fun.
You can find him in Owings Mills or at the ballpark. You can find me, Nasty, at WNST.net. We are merging WNST.net with Baltimore Positive at AM 1570, where we never stop talking Orioles and Ravens and stuff.